Principles of Economics, my complete guide to understanding economics, is now available in hardcover, audiobook, and ebook from Saifedean.com, Amazon, and many more booksellers worldwide. And now I am also teaching a course based on this book on my website, Saifedean.com. Principles of Economics will run the whole academic year, from September to June, and will have a new lecture every 2 weeks, as well as weekly live online discussion seminars open to learners from all over the world and from all walks of life. Whether you're a student, a professional, or a retiree, you are making economic decisions every day, and this course will arm you with the wisdom of centuries of economists to improve your economic decision-making. You'll also get a free book of Principles of Economics if you sign up for the course, and if you do it before September 20th, you'll get a 20% discount. Go to Saifedean.com and sign up now. The Bitcoin Standard podcast is brought to you by Crowd Health. Crowd Health is the Bitcoiner's answer to fiat health insurance. If you listen to this show, you've probably heard me rail against the problems of modern healthcare and health insurance. Crowd Health is a brilliant new solution to this problem that leverages the power of Bitcoin to help people get affordable healthcare. Crowd Health holds its cash reserves in Bitcoin. It negotiates with healthcare providers on your behalf and gets you much better rates by offering to pay them cash upfront without having to go through the expensive bureaucracy of modern healthcare insurance. It's a solution that works better for healthcare providers and for patients by disintermediating large insurance companies who have the wrong incentives and are constantly raising costs. I'm very happy to have signed up for Crowd Health, and I'm really excited to support them as they disrupt the fiat health insurance industry. Go to joincrowdhealth.com and use the discount code SAIF, S-A-I-F, and you'll get the first 6 months for $99 only. Hello and welcome to another episode of the Bitcoin Standard podcast. A year and a half ago, Michael Saylor very graciously invited me to stay in his beautiful house in Miami Beach. I thought long and hard about what kind of gift I could get somebody like Michael Saylor. Well, there is nobody like Michael Saylor, but what can you get for somebody like Michael Saylor? I thought long and hard, and I decided I could probably make something special happen if I got him a pile of Austrian economics books. And so, indeed, I ordered a bunch of Austrian economics books from the Mises Institute and had them delivered to his address. And I thought, he had expressed sympathy and interest in Austrian ideas before. And I'm sure that with a stack of Austrian books in front of him, he's going to find something interesting in the work of Rothbard, Mises, Hayek, and all the rest of them. And I would definitely be very interested in finding out what Michael Saylor thinks about these works. Well, he took the bait. He picked up Murray Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty, a 1,700-page monster of a book, a great book by Murray Rothbard, and he read it. And a year after that visit, I saw him again, and he told me he read that book and he was extremely impressed with it. He enjoyed it a lot, and he had so many wonderful ideas to share about what was in that book. So I'm inviting Michael here today to join us and discuss this book. And we're also inviting Patrick Newman, who is a fellow at the Mises Institute and a professor of economics at the University of Tampa, and the editor of the fifth and final volume of Rothbard's book. Rothbard had only written the fifth volume by hand, and the publishing house which had published the first four went out of business. But the fifth volume, nobody could decipher Murray Rothbard's handwriting. And so for many years, it just lay there as an indecipherable notebook until Patrick Newman showed up at the Mises Institute and spent an entire summer learning how to decipher Murray Rothbard's handwriting, and then was able to transcribe the fifth volume from Rothbardese to English and translate it from Rothbardese to English. And thanks to him, we have the fifth volume. So thank you so much, gentlemen, for joining me today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Happy to meet you, Patrick. Looking forward to this discussion. Safe.
Yeah, thanks for having me on, and nice to meet you as well, Michael.
All right, so to begin with, Michael, I'm just going to give you the ball and let you run. What did you think of Conceived in Liberty?
Well, so first, I want to say for the record, I got all these books and I stacked them on my end table in my bedroom in Miami Beach, and it was a lot of books, and they were very tall. And first, I tried to ignore them, and then I went and I started thumbing through them, and it was a bit daunting. But before I actually did Conceived in Liberty, I actually read an Austrian perspective on the history of economic thought by Rothbard. And so that kind of traced from 2000 BC forward all of the economic thinkers. And it was kind of a story of someone comes up with a good economic idea, they get smashed down. Someone else comes up with a good economic idea that's rational, let people keep their stuff, they get smashed down. Someone else comes along. Every 100 years, there's an intelligent person in some country or some civilization that points out that if you don't steal all the property from all the people and crush them to death, it'll be good for morale and you might actually grow the economy. And always there's a little fire, and then they always get smashed down, and it goes on and on and on and on and on, all the way, up through, Locke and the liberal ideas of Reformation Europe. And after I finished that, and that's kind of, it's inspirational but depressing both at the same time. Rothbard does a really good job of pointing out to you that there are intelligent, rational people for thousands and thousands of years, and generally they come to no good end. But and he has, the guy's a saint because he must have had so much passion and so much energy to be able to slog through and do the research and write these stories because normally in Hollywood, we like to see the story of the protagonist, or the hero that struggles against adversity and wins. And Rothbard, kind of writes 1,000 examples of the hero that struggles against adversity, almost wins, and then has, defeat hammered down by some ignorant, like they'll spend 40 years cultivating the next king of France, teaching him everything about intelligent economics and liberalism, and the guy's about to take over control of the country, and then he dies of a disease in 4 weeks accidentally, and they're stuck with the next guy who knows nothing. So that's the story of thousands of years of economic thought. And then I got to Conceived in Liberty, and I was very interested in that because as an American, most Americans our study of history consists of some Europeans came to the New World. They colonized. Everything was good until the British treated them shabbily, and then they threw off the reins of tyranny, and here we are. And it's generally very simple. And there's a American Revolution. And you think that the history before is oftentimes homogeneous, or if they tell you the story, it's a very summarized narrative. They've reduced it down to one paragraph. So Murray Rothbard offers this book, and it is comprehensive. I mean, the first 4 volumes are 262 chapters. And it's 262 chapters of aspiration and ego and self-preservation driving some people to go to the New World to try to establish a better life. And then every single one of the stories is either a struggle against tyranny, a struggle against adversity, and ultimately power corrupting, and absolute power corrupting absolutely, and then the people all being abused, eventually abused so badly that they rebel, with most of the rebellions failing. But, first they flee the tyranny, and then they rebel, and then most of the rebellions fail. But this entire colonial experiment is this crucible of experimentation where you've got some liberal ideas and some aspiration that's planted into, a continent. And as you watch all of the different colonial experiments careen into each other and then struggle internally, I mean, they're dominated by internal power struggles, external power struggles with the Indians, power struggles with the Europeans, power struggles between the European empires, and then power struggles of domestic political nature, in the UK over and over again. You just see this careening chaos where ultimately, the hero is the liberal philosophers, the Lockean figures that planted the idea of liberty in the minds of settlers. And then the unsung heroes that generally aren't written about, they're struggling, they're running from the tyrants all the time, trying to live their life, being interfered with. And it's 262 chapters of brutal pain and struggle and tragedy, like a tragedy of ego combined or wrapped with a comedy of errors that careens toward a final revolution or a final rebellion, the last one we remember, and through that chaos rise a set of founding fathers that actually reflect the best values that we've seen of a founding nation in a long, long time, and thousands of years, where you find a set of people that do embrace some of the ideology of Locke, some of the ideology of capitalism, and establish a nation of or a country of checks and balances. But throughout, it's imperfect, corrupt, and chaotic, and uncertain, and you can't help but just sit back and marvel at this crucible that incubated this nation that became an imperfect torchbearer for liberty. And I look at the title, Conceived in Liberty, and I just think Murray Rothbard has such a dry sense of humor because he wrote 262 chapters about anything but liberty, right? And so there are people that are sort of struggling for it, but they're just generally the ones getting beat to death the entire time until the nation arises and it's thought of as, the greatest standard bearer of liberty. And truthfully, I suppose it is compared to everything else, but I can't help but think that, this is the triumph of the least worst, right? And that's my takeaway from it. And we could talk about the 262 chapters, right? I mean, it is 1,700 pages, and every one of the stories is gripping, blood-curdling, fascinating, right? And every one of them make a great movie, except so many of them kind of end with the villains winning and the good guys crawling off or running off somewhere else to lick their wounds and try again over and over and over again, which is probably why it wouldn't be commercial. But I thought what was really useful about the entire book, and for the audience, I would say to everybody, you should read it, right? And if you don't want to read it, you should download the audiobook and you should listen to it, because it's one of those things where at any age, whether you're in your 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever point in life you are, listening to it grounds you back into the human struggle, for sovereignty and freedom, versus tyranny and the collective. And so I think it's very, very valuable to read it. But I also think you can be lost in the hundreds and hundreds of chapters of struggle because there are just so many. And it's always, each one of them is about some decent group of people being beat up or abused or victimized by some arrogant, egotistical, power-hungry tyrant that somehow thinks they know best. So I think that the most constructive thing for podcasts like this is rather than dwell too much on the individual examples of dysfunctional government, of which there are so many, it's more interesting to look at the insights that come out of the 262 chapters. And I will, disclaim, Patrick, I haven't read the 5th volume. My study goes from when the Europeans hit the shore and the conditions leading up to it, all the way to the victory of the Americans at Yorktown.
I should say, what is one of the many astonishing things about this book is that I think if you were a historian and you produced this book over a 40-year career, this would be an incredibly successful career for any historian. I mean, if you were a US historian or an economic historian and you came up with this book on its own and published approximately nothing else, this would still be a remarkably prolific and successful publication career. And Murray Rothbard did this plus dozens of other works of similar size or even larger size.
He's incredibly productive.
It's astonishing, and he did it all on the typewriters and with his pen. And so, history of economic thought is one of the most comprehensive histories of economic thought written, and his history of the U.S. is one of the most gripping and fascinating histories of the U.S. written. And then there's all of his economics work, which is many, many thousands upon thousands of pages across books and journals. Patrick, give us some of your insights into the volume overall and what you think, what you thought of it.
Oh, of course. Conceived in Liberty is a great. It's a great history. It's been published many times. Rothbard originally wrote it in the 1960s, and then it was published in the 1970s around the 200-year anniversary of the American Revolution. And then the Mises Institute over the years has published a volume. Most recently, they have the whole volume 1 to 4 in one giant book that if you've ever held it or held it while trying to read it, you're almost getting a workout while you're doing so. It's literally so big. And it's full of lots of information, and it's absolutely a history of early America that I remember being taught to me in elementary school in my K through 12 education at a much more obviously superficial level, but some of the basics was still taught. I think it's very unfortunate the way history is often taught now, that a lot of those details of the American Revolution and what was animating the founding fathers and the colonists have sort of been revised, you could say. And it's incredible, as Saifedean pointed out, is that Rothbard was, he had many, many research interests. He was a polymath in many ways, in that he wrote this giant book on economics, man, economy, and state. Then he wrote this giant book on early American history. Then he wrote this giant book on the history of economic thought, and so on. And that's only just sort of a fraction of what he wrote, of the books he wrote. He wrote a book on the Great Depression. He wrote a book on libertarian ethics. He wrote a lot of stuff. And as Saifedean pointed out, someone's entire career could just be on early American history. And they would publish this 4-volume book or this 5-volume book, and that would be sort of the capstone of their career. And for Rothbard, it was really only just one of his many voluminous contributions. And it's absolutely a series that I recommend people read or listen to the audiobook. I myself have been, in the 5th volume, have written a shortened overview of the book. Of volumes 1 through 4, but it's I think it's very, very important. It's very important to understand how the country was founded and all of the struggles. As Michael pointed out, very often when you speak truth to power, power comes and gets you. right? The intellectuals in the sort of the radicals fighting for liberty and decentralization and in free markets, they can often live an ostracized life. They're sort of shut out from the halls of power. They don't have the most prestigious jobs, or they don't have all the political connections, and that's because they're a threat. As Rothbard himself was a threat, and as he's described throughout his book, through Conceived in Liberty, various people, when they were threats, they get ostracized. Various intellectuals, when they're threats, they get ostracized. And so much of American history is built on people who were ostracized, but they basically kept on persevering. And I think that's a very important insight that we can't forget. That's just really revealed through so much of the information that Rothbard provides in his book.
I wrote down, about a bit more than 16 interesting points that I took out of the book that are illustrated by the hundreds and hundreds of examples. And I thought that might be a useful framework for us to discuss.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I guess, I'll start with a big idea. If you said summarize the book, I'd say, okay, the summary of the book is history is the story of the triumph of more powerful currencies, religions, cultures, and governments over less powerful competitors. It's really a triumph of power. And when you look at all of the stories and you try to make sense of it, like why did that happen the way it happened? Ultimately, it's just the triumph. Humans have a will to power, and it's a triumph of power. And the more powerful entity displaces the less powerful entity, and the competition is going on in the religious domain, the economic domain, the physical domain, all these domains, all the ideological domain, all the time. And we could start with an interesting observation, right? Currency, right? We all know currency is a unit of account, a medium of exchange, a store of value, and a system of control, right? I love those four, right? Very interesting. Well, religion is a unit of moral account, a medium of indoctrination, a store of values, and a system of control. And a government, if it's going to be effective, generally you want the religion to channel political power, just like you want the currency to channel economic power. And the point of the government is to channel physical power. And the government is also, it's this, unit of cultural account, and it's a method of education and violence. It's a store of culture. It's a system of control. And so throughout human history, the governments find themselves more powerful if they adopt a religion, and some religions are better at channeling political power than others. And oftentimes you find that, if you're the leader of a country and you want to get 1 million people to do what you want them to do, just saying do it because I told you to do it doesn't work that well. But if you can enlist them in an ideology, right? Religion is the original political party, and the secular version of a religion is a political party, right? That's when we replaced religion, we replaced it with the Communist Party, or we replaced it with the Socialist Party or some other party. But ultimately, throughout history, and if you look at all these stories, religion plays a big part in each of the colonies. And generally, a lot of these struggles are one colony versus another, and one religious group versus another religious group. But this is lapsing back into history in general. You find that throughout history, thousands and thousands and thousands of times, the way that someone consolidates power is they all agree on a state religion. The religion has ritual. We're all going to meet, every Sunday, on the Sabbath, on a Saturday, on a Sunday, on a whatever. We're all going to recite the same mantras. We're all going to agree on the same values. You're going to participate. Since we all agree on the same values, we agree that people that don't share our values are the enemy. And very rapidly, as soon as you distinguish one group from another group, it's a very short hop to, and therefore we can seize their property, and therefore we should kill them because they won't give us their property. And so economic tyranny followed by abuse, followed by war, it normally follows from these religious distinctions. And, if I look at conceived in liberty, what's fascinating is you got to watch hundreds of experiments in political economy take place over about 200 years. And so there wasn't one. You had this continent, right, which was very special. It was a very fertile piece of land. On the south is a desert. On the north is tundra. To the west is an uncrossable ocean, the Pacific, just utterly impossible to cross. On the east, it took thousands of years, and eventually the Europeans figured out how to cross it, and it was very difficult. In fact, logistics turn out to be the deciding factor, right, in the success of the American Revolution, more so than any tactics or any strategy or any action of anybody, right? A conclusion is just they were lucky that it took 12 weeks to get across an ocean, and it was very difficult and extremely hard to send men and material back and forth and to communicate. And because of that, you had this kind of semi-closed system, where you could run all these experiments without the interference that took place so routinely in Europe and in Asia, and that's the American exercise. The first thing you take away is, one insight is the triumph of technology. The triumph of, what did the Europeans have going for them? They showed up with guns, germs, and steel, and they just showed up. And from that point, it was a foregone conclusion that one of the European tribes was going to win, because what they met when they showed up was a set of Indians that weren't even Neolithic. If you look at the, European history, you've got Stone Age going to Neolithic, where go to Malta in 2500 BC. They're pretty good at creating stone temples, just like the Egyptians erected a lot of stone temples. So the American Indians didn't even have that. They didn't even work well with large blocks of stone. They definitely didn't get to copper. They didn't get to bronze. They didn't get to iron. They didn't get to steel. They didn't get to gunpowder. And, the story of European history is 10,000 invasions and bloody wars that resulted in the mixing of so many different peoples and so many plagues over and over again, such that you had a very biologically tough group of people that had guns and had steel, and they were going to win regardless. And so the smartest thing the Indians did, as far as I could see, is when the Europeans showed up, if they murdered every single European that stepped foot on the shore, that was their best bet, their best idea, and they might actually get 100 years or 50 years of peace. As soon as the Europeans set up and they started to set up a village and colonize and got a beachhead, that was the end for the Indians. And what happened was just 300 years of brutal, and deterministic genocide, right? And they never had a chance. Now, I'm not really arguing in favor of the moral superiority of the Indians over the Europeans. right? The other theme you see, is endless tribal wars, right? The American Indians had endless tribal wars, and the story of history is 10,000 tribal wars. The only difference between the Europeans and Rothbard's history and the Indians' history is, since the Indians didn't have a very advanced culture, no one wrote it down. And so the 15,000 years of endless tribal wars amongst thousands of Indian tribes just aren't recorded history, right? And every one of them, if they were recorded, they would have a story of rise through adversity, leading to prosperity, leading to eventual moral decay, leading to corruption, leading to being crushed by another Indian tribe, right? So they weren't much better, but it was pretty clear that all the Indian tribes were getting displaced. What's funny here is there are a lot of stories in the book about a governor, right? The governor of Virginia, a governor of Maryland, a governor of New York that abused the colonist. And then if they abused the colonist too much, like, for example, in early Virginia, it's the death penalty to not go to church. It's the death penalty to try to go home. It's the death penalty to try to leave. It's the death penalty to break a rule. I mean, they pretty much kill you for anything you do. Criticizing the boss, puts you in jail for a month, and criticizing him 3 times, it's a death penalty. So you read that and you think, wow, the governor wasn't so nice, right? It's pretty awful communist tyranny. And so for that reason, they rebelled against the governor. I get that. But then when they had a liberal governor that said, don't murder the Indians, they rebelled against them too. And there the infraction was, the governor won't let us murder the Indians. And so it wasn't like the colonists were the good guys. It was a story of the British fighting with the Spaniards, fighting with the French, the Spaniards murdering all the Indians and enslaving them, the Indians enslaving each other all the time, the colonists wishing to murder all the Indians. And when they did it the hard way, they used guns. But, lots of stories of the colonists they would seize some land from the Indians. The Indians would object. They would fight over it. An Indian would kill a colonist. The colonist would murder 20 Indians, and then they would declare war. The colonists would send the Indians a bunch of smallpox-infested blankets. 1 million Indians would, or hundreds of thousands would die because of the smallpox and germ warfare, which, I mean, you're kind of amazed at just how diabolically creative all of these people are. I didn't bother just to go murder all the women and children with guns. I actually infected them all with smallpox and just let the plague do the job for me. And they kind of knew that would work, which, it leaves you shaking your head. But you can't make this stuff up. For example, the colonists get in a fight with the Indians. They want their land. The Indians don't want to give up the land. So the colonists raise an army to defend themselves. And then they go march off to fight with the Indians that are murdering the colonists. But along the way, there's a peaceful Indian tribe that happens to be doing no harm to anybody. And they don't have any guns. So the colonists murder all of them because they've also got land. And somebody running the militia thinks it's a lot easier to kill the friendly Indian tribe than it is to kill the hostile Indian tribe. And if you were to go back in time and someone said, give me some advice, about how I coexist, I mean, the answer is, the weaker party doesn't coexist, right? You can run, but ultimately, it's going to be the triumph of power. And so, a Steel Age set of colonists with gunpowder and biological immunity and steel, they were going to displace the indigenous tribes. And it was just a question of how much violence was going to take place and how brutal it would be over time. And So my takeaway from that is you really want to be the technology leader, right? And there is no future for your culture, and no amount of appeasement and no amount of diplomacy and no amount of reasonable trade works. Ultimately, this was the story of the most powerful displacing the least powerful.
Yeah, I think all that's very, very insightful, Michael. And just to sort of comment on some of the things that you were discussing, I agree that Rothbard's overall framework is the story of liberty versus power. Right? He views history as the story of individuals in favor of voluntary cooperation and free markets, decentralization, versus those in favor of greater government authority and less individual freedom and so on. And that for most of history, unfortunately, power triumphs. We can say liberty is responsible for the great flourishing, the massive, incredible living standards that we all have, the fact that we're all able to basically communicate virtually from different parts of the world and all of that. And that's ultimately due to capitalism and liberties, as Rothbard would say. But you also have power, right? And a big theme of Rothbard's book is that power corrupts. And he goes through this, is that whenever sort of the forces of liberty control a government, or they finally oust the forces of power, they in a sense, to quote Lord Acton, or to paraphrase Lord Acton, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. And then they start to use the government for their own ends. They start to favor their own supporters. They start to restrict competition, whether in currency or religion or other sorts of, business activities, et cetera. And this is what you ultimately have. And this even happened after the Revolutionary War for much of American history. And I know you commented on the importance of religion for basically spreading government propaganda, especially back in the day. And I think I agree, because another big theme, a recurring part of Rothbard's history and conceived in liberty, as well as elsewhere, is what he called, or what has been called, the alliance of throne and altar, right? So it's this alliance between the government and between a established religion. And it's sort of I'll scratch your back if you scratch my back. The government builds a nice church, or gives that church a monopoly, or says, well, we'll give you some money or whatever. And then that church basically turns around and justifies the government. They say the king is divine. His acts come from God. Or the royal governor, we have to listen to him, or you have to go fight for him. You have to go die for him. You have to go on his plantation or his feudal manor and repair his road or something. And this is why the founding fathers ultimately tried to basically separate church and state. They didn't want an established religion that would be a mouthpiece for the government and all of its various interventions. And that in the modern form, we don't necessarily have religion doing that work, but we have intellectuals. It's like the secularized alliance of throne and altar. You get the government privileging various intellectuals, giving them a research grant, giving them some sort of university funding or work at a prominent think tank or government agency. And in return, those intellectuals turn around and they say you have to support government interventions X, Y, and Z. Not necessarily because it's holy, so to speak, but it's because it will benefit the public welfare. And that's really the modern sense, and that's why it's so difficult to sort of break free, you could say, from power, because they have the intellectual game. They have it they have it quite nicely. And they've certainly done their job in making sure that their viewpoint is the one that's well heard, and there's the viewpoint that looks prestigious and prominent, whereas the other viewpoints are sort of ostracized and left out. And then just to one final comment when you're talking about the Indians and land, et cetera, and another major kind of recurring aspect of Rothbard's book is that to the extent that liberty was able to triumph in what became the United States or the colony, it was ultimately due to the abundance of land. The British, really starting with the English, the French, really we could just concentrate on the English, and then they became the British. They really tried to replicate feudalism in the colonies. They had first colonized Ireland, through like a hundreds of years process of subjugation. And they said, well, this is great. Why don't we do the same thing in North America? We've got the Virginia colony. We've got Maryland. There was a certain Lord Baltimore, Virginia, named after Virgin Queen Elizabeth, and all of that stuff. They said, we're going to grant the land to a bunch of our favorite supporters, have a bunch of people work on that land. And the problem was there was just too much land. The people could leave. And also England was preoccupied with civil wars. And whenever England really tried to enforce anything, the colonists rose up. And there were the Indians, and there was a lot of conflict, unfortunately, between those groups. I mean, ultimately, the center of their difficulty was the question over land. It's that who owned all of this land? A lot of the colonists were sort of imbued with the Lockean, well, in order to really own land, you have to do something to the land. You have to chop down the trees. You have to till. You have to irrigate some land. You have to grow crops. You have to do something to it. And a lot of the Indian tribes were less settled. Hunter and gatherers. One way of describing it could be too harsh, but of course, when they say, "Well, we own this whole forest," and the colonists say, well, no, you don't. You didn't do anything to the forest. There's going to be conflict, unfortunately. And that's an ugly side of Rothbard's book. It's that, as you mentioned, the quite honestly, sort of the genocidal characteristics. And this was, this was life back then. It was kill or be killed, right? You're under this constant state of threat. You could have your head chopped off or blown up. If you didn't obey someone, you get the death penalty. And then we decided on a more lenient form of punishment where if you steal someone's horse, they're going to cut your ear. They're going to clip it. So everyone will always see it. You'll be forever branded. Goes on your permanent record, et cetera. And yeah, life was rough back then. And it's just incredible how people managed to deal with that. And in a sense, how a lot of the things, liberty versus power, alliance with throne and altar, they're still with us today. And so I think that those are important takeaways from Rothbard's Conceived in Liberty.
Yeah, to the extent that there's virtue that pops out following the American Revolution, and of course there's a lot of imperfections at that point too. But the virtue from the American experiment is, you could attribute to the fact that the Europeans showed up with superior technology and they found a set of extremely valuable property, highly desirable property that they could take from a Stone Age people. Like they could simply seize it because the indigenous people couldn't defend it. So that was a benefit to them. And then they were so far away from Europe, it was difficult for the rest of the Europeans to meddle with them and screw it up. So that was a benefit. And then the third benefit is they ran all these different experiments, and there were so many bad ones where they had colonies destroyed by the intertwining of religion and government, and they had corruption due to absolute power, that by the time they got to the American Revolution, all of the learned men that were involved would have been familiar with all of the awful results from the previous political experiments of the past 200 years. And so that, separation of church and state was one of the rallying cries of the revolution. And you can see why, because as soon as the religion got entwined with absolute power, life became hell on earth for the people that lived in the colony. But it's not that absolute power combined with religion is losing. In fact, oftentimes it's winning. But what made the difference here was all these colonies were in competition with each other, and there was extra space to go west, to your point. So every single time an awful form of government aligned with an awful religious influence and some authoritarian or tyrant implemented a set of batshit crazy, irrational rules, people fled, either fled west or they fled north or they fled south, so that the irrational authoritarians had their colony collapse. And so the rational political economic exercises were more successful in this market, right? The entire North American continent became a marketplace of political economic ideas. And in other examples in human history, when the authoritarian got control of the country, they just simply murdered everybody. And so the best idea didn't always win because brute force came into play. But here, like, for example, in New York, you had a feudal architecture where you had a few rich families that owned everything, owned all the land. And in Pennsylvania, you could actually come and get land. So with this flow of people from Europe to the New World, everybody would land in Philadelphia. They would go to Pennsylvania because they knew that if they landed in New York, they would be a serf. And if they went to Pennsylvania, they might have property rights. And so there was a triumph. The idea that individuals should be able to own property was competing with a feudal colony, the idea that only 10 families owned all the property. And in that competition, the more rational idea ended up getting all the immigrants, and then they had more power, and they were able to defend themselves against the irrational idea. Peter Stuyvesant, as Dutch governor of New York, was a, unmitigated tyrant, crazy. And so it turned out that when the British sailed on New York, most of the people in New York didn't want to defend him. And so he didn't have an army, because why would you want to fight for an irrational authoritarian tyrant when the people that are going to take over are actually going to treat you better? So what you found is that the Dutch got squeezed out of the New World because they were just awful. Like, I have to tell this story. It's just so ridiculous. Like, the Dutch show up in Delaware, and they start a colony, and they coexist peacefully with the Indians. And then one day the Dutch start throwing trash out the backside of their colony. And one of the things they throw out is a silver ashtray that has the stamp of the king or the monarch of the Netherlands on it. And some Indians find the ashtray, the silver ashtray, and since they don't have silver, they think this is cool. So they melt it down and they make a pipe, and they give it to the chief of the Indian tribe. So, I could never make this up. You would never believe it. So the chief of the Indian tribe, living in peace with the Dutch colonist, smokes the silver pipe pulled out of a trash heap. And some of the Dutch colonists see the Indian smoking the silver pipe. They take offense because they realize he's got silver. They don't want Indians to have silver. And he took the silver from the ashtray that had the stamp of the Dutch monarch on it, and that makes it treason. And so they murder him for committing treason against the monarch of the Netherlands. They kill... It's pretty evil to kill a random innocent person for smoking a pipe. Killing someone for picking your trash out is like stupid, double evil. Killing the chief of the Indian tribe is just moronic. So, of course, the Indians then kill all the Dutch colonists. And so that's the end of that, right? And so people do such irrational, stupid things, not just evil. It's evil to murder all your own people and keep the guns. It's stupid to murder your enemy's chief while they can still fight back, for no reason. But the Dutch got squeezed out because they were just irrational, right? And then the British were the beneficiaries of the Dutch being stupid. The French kind of coexisted peacefully as best they could with the Indians by just trading. I mean, they showed up and they traded with the Indians. But the problem with trading is, trading is not nearly as powerful a metaphor. The French didn't show up and kill all the Indians and settle and farm the land. They just traded with them. So that meant that the British had 20 times as many people in the British colonies as the French had. So when the battle came, the British had soldiers and they could trample the French interest because the French didn't actually accumulate enough manpower to fight back. And so they were squeezed out of the continent. You know, again, it's not like a victory of the kindest and the gentlest and the most rational. It's the victory of the most powerful, and they happen to believe in some liberty, but it's a victory of the most powerful. So the Dutch get squeezed out because they're stupid. The French get squeezed out because they're not powerful enough and they're just traitors. And if you look at the history of warfare, I mean, you'll love this one. This is your favorite subject, Saifedean, diets, right? Right? If I want to actually feed an army, I feed them wheat and grain because I can grow a lot of corn and a lot of wheat on acreage. And the carrying capacity of agricultural land that spits out starches is 10x to 20x the carrying capacity of, a hunter-gatherer or a rancher. So I can't feed my soldiers meat. I have to feed them biscuit. And yeah, it's going to kill them at some point, but not before the age of 30. And so I just need the army to make it to 30, and then I've got 20 times as many soldiers, and I can kill everybody. So the Roman army, the Egyptian army, all these agricultural armies are fed on low quality grain that isn't best long term, but it works fine in the short term. And the British colonists in the U.S. benefited from the same thing. They implemented agriculture. And because they implemented agriculture, they had more manpower to man the militia to push back the French and to push back the Spaniards, right? And so it was their economy that was better. And we see so many examples of this, where by the time you'd lived in the U.S. for 200 years, or if you had any degree of history, right? Rothbard's history is novel to us, but it wasn't novel, to Jefferson and Washington and Adams and the other founding figures in the American Revolution. What they would have seen would have informed them, and so I think they try to keep religion out as best they can. Eventually, religion morphs into secular ideology, and secular ideology becomes a political party. And when a political party gets control of the apparatus of government, they then can turn the state education and the state taxation and the state regulatory authorities in favor of their political interests. And then you have another corruption that happens. But for a while, right, they tried to hold back on that.
Oh yeah, I mean it's incredible when we're looking at the past how all of that plays together. And I mean, going through, well, one, just how different the world was with the people fighting each other and people killing each other. And in many ways, superiority comes down to a function of population. Right? How many people do you have? And of course, how big, your economy is. And that was really Great Britain's strength, is that they had their revolution in the 1600s. They got that over. They had a civil war, then they had a glorious revolution, and that created basically a constitutional monarchy, which at the time, up to that point, was what we might say is the best governance system. And as opposed to, say, like an absolutist monarchy where the king can basically do whatever they want, such as in France or in Spain or Tsarist Russia or whatever. Instead, the king of Great Britain was the king of England, king of Great Britain, was constrained. Parliament had some power, and then that happened in the late 1600s, 1688. And then in the early 1700s, you have this policy of salutary neglect, which is basically, for a variety of reasons, the British government is not enforcing its navigation laws, which literally, in a sense, destroy the economy to benefit privileged interests in Great Britain. And this allows the economies of the New World, the British colonies, to explode, their populations to explode. And it becomes an area where people want to go to. I mean, we forget Europe was just actually so dense. You had paupers. There was an abundance of labor relative to land, and you had people literally practically starving, and they were begging to go to the New World. And now you have this area where everyone has so much farmland, you can grow the crops that you want to grow, and this really powers the colonies in their various economies, and that is really what is the decisive edge, say, compared to France, right? When you get to the French and Indian War, or even Spain and really the French, where you had British basically had a better system of governance, and for all of its faults, that's translated to the colonies. And they actually wanted to have their colonies thrive and grow, and that was just a simple manpower advantage. And then, of course, after this, I mean, it wasn't entirely just that, but of course, after this, then you get into various problems when Great Britain tries to then impose its laws and its regulations. But the reason why Britain won is their economy was better, their system of governance was better. Or the reason why the British or the colonies won, say, over the Indian tribes is, well, their economy was better, their system of governance was better. They could benefit from an enormous amount of technology and thriving market economies that led to more sophisticated technologies, including defense, firearms, and all of that stuff, and being able to grow food literally on farms, and instead of hunting for it or having much more limited agricultural production. And it's just interesting, because a lot of the stuff we don't really think about. No one's really settling new land, or no one really owns their own farm or something like that, or much less owns like a musket. But that was very important, and I think those are some major reasons why, of course, what became the United States was, of course, an English-speaking nation.
Yeah, you can see the merits of political dysfunction, right? I mean, there are lots of examples where Parliament was in conflict with the monarchy, and the business interests were struggling with each other, and that kind of emasculated the British from being able to control the colonies. That, plus, I really think the distance was significant. If you look at the breakup of the Roman Empire, right? I mean, you couldn't rule the East from Rome, and so they eventually moved to Byzantium or Constantinople, because it just takes too long for a message to go. So you couldn't reasonably micromanage the colonies from London, and there are a lot of examples where there was a lot more tyranny and authoritarian conduct of the government in Britain over the British than there was over the colonists. There are a lot of laws, and a lot of them were just ignored, right? I mean, they passed all sorts of batshit crazy rules. I mean, so many. I mean, sometimes the crazy rules came out of London. Sometimes the crazy rules came from the governor. It could be something as simple as, you're not allowed to make hats. You're not allowed to bake bread. You're not allowed to, you can't cross this side of the river to the other side of the river. You can never underestimate the number of just batshit crazy rules human beings come up with. You can't hold your wife's hand. You can't be out in public without a hat. You can't mention these words, etc. It went on and on and on, but many of them were ignored, and it was a lot easier to ignore them when it was difficult to project power. And so we think about how you actually project power or impose your power on someone else. Ultimately, the British, they had to impose their authority on the colonists using local labor, the colonists. And so ultimately, anyone that traveled that far across the ocean would eventually go native and start to associate and start to identify more with their fellow colonists, then they identified with the British. They put down roots, they raised a family, they identified it. So now you're ordering someone in Boston to abuse other people in Boston, and it's not so easy to tell someone to murder themselves. Whereas, it's particularly telling, by the way, ironic that, in the Revolutionary War, the British didn't want to fight the Americans, and they ended up hiring a bunch of German mercenaries. And they had to send a bunch of Germans over to fight the Americans because the British didn't want to fight. And when the Germans got to the New World, right, and this is, of course, the triumph of the least worst. Life is so awful in Germany that they simply wanted to defect, or jump ship and go and start their own life in the New World. So 25% would desert. 25% would die, in the struggle. The last half would over time decide I'm in this for 12 or 24 months, then I'm gone. And from the point that you actually sent the army, you're bleeding out 2 or 3% of your manpower a month, right? And so if you don't win a quick victory, you're not winning at all. And if you can't get the people to want to comply from a distance, then you're going to lose control of them. And this is what takes you back to the power of religion again. Ultimately, you need the people to all agree to comply. And the most effective way to get people to agree to comply is to promise them, paradise in the afterlife, and to get them to agree that this is more important than anything on earth. And the only way to get them to agree on that is to, indoctrinate them, if not every day, like every week of their life from an early age. And this is why religion just keeps popping up over and over again. We talk about Bitcoin forks, right? And digital currency forks. Well, a cryptocurrency is an ideology, and a fork is like a religious schism. And you can learn a lot by looking at the old religious schisms, right? This entire story is dominated by forks of ambition and aspiration. And if I'm being charitable, I'll say there was a group of people, in Europe that were abused and disenfranchised, and they somehow wanted to rise above their station. And so they formed a group. The group eventually became a religious movement, whether it's the Puritans or the Quakers or the something, right? And by forming that religious affiliation, they were able to channel all of their cultural energy and their political energy in pursuit of their goals. And that's the story for 10,000 years that we've been recording history. That's the charitable way to describe it. The more cynical way to describe it is a bunch of nobles in northern Germany wanted to cut off, the Roman Catholic Church. And so they found Martin Luther and they began to support him because his narrative fit their ambition. And, Henry VIII decided that he wanted to support the Anglican Church because that idea fit his ambition. And so all of these forks in religion are really political ambitions, and oftentimes there's a very powerful actor behind them, or a set of actors, a set of merchants that want to push back against a set of aristocrats, or one nation or one prince that wants to push back against some other prince. And the result is you just have a never-ending set of different Protestant sects. Pretty soon the British have flipped to Protestantism, and then you're Catholic and you're stuck in the UK. And so you're getting drawn and quartered. And, what they do to each other is just so horrific as you can't even say it on a podcast, right? But if you're Catholic in Britain, you've got to flee for your life. And that explains Maryland. And if you're a Protestant in France, you're a Huguenot, you have to flee for your life. And that explains, another colony. And the one thing that just tends to be a commonality is just about every religion, as soon as they get get control of a government, whether it's a small colony or it's a small unit, they get more and more powerful, and then they begin to abuse their power, and pretty soon they're abusing other religious sects just as badly as they were abused at the start of their ideological life. And then even when you have examples of pacifist religious sects, like the Quakers, they start out pacifist and they're the model of pacifism until they actually have a modicum of success in Pennsylvania. And then all of a sudden they become the party supporting the war against the Indians or the war against something. So eventually, the ideologies which are virtuous over the course of 2 or 3 or 4 generations eventually are corrupted. And this story of the human condition in the United States or the pre-United States Americas, it's just one of these life cycles after the other. It's not clear that any one of them was any better than any other, but if you had to say, why did we get America? You would say, well, everybody had some isolation from the massive empires of Germany and France and the Netherlands and Britain. And maybe the least dysfunctional one, the British, which, their virtue was their dysfunction, right? The parliament fighting with the monarch all the time. And that was, and the fact that they were busy and distracted. It's not like they were virtuous. They were just less worse, right? The least worse. So they have the best combination of ideas, and then they plant so many colonies, and you've got the ones that are feudal, like Maryland and New York, and those ones are weakened by the ones that are more open, the Rhode Islands or the Pennsylvanias. And then you have the communist police colonies that pop up, like Georgia and the like, and then you have people fleeing, right? And you have natural forces, right? I mean, isn't America like the greatest triumph of natural law, right? We talk about the virtues of Bitcoin is it's natural. The virtues of Locke, right, and the virtues of liberty are natural rights. And so you had this triumph of natural law, and why? Because you got as far away as you could from the artificial impact of massive European armies. At the end of the day, it wasn't easy to you couldn't put 100,000 soldier army into the field in the colonies at any point in time, right? The logistics were just impossible to do it. So you had isolation from that. Then you had a decentralization in the form of natural competition. Not just the colonies as we know it, right? But like Plymouth was at war politically with Boston for a lot of this time period, right? The various cities were struggling with each other. On the eve of the American Revolution, Vermont was at war with New York, right? And part of New Hampshire. So you had all the colonies struggling with each other. You had the checks and balances of the French checking the Brits, and oftentimes the Americans played the French off against the British and vice versa. You had the Spanish, that were a check and balance on the British. Then you had the Indian tribes that were a check and balance, so that if one colony was too irrational, right, the Indians would ally with another colony. So you had a lot of checks and balances due to lots of natural constituencies. And then you had this option. If you're a colonist in the New World and you were abused by the New Yorkers, you could get across the river to Pennsylvania or to New Jersey, and maybe you lived a better life. And so you always had that as a pressure valve, and the option to go and or acquire property somewhere else created natural feedback and natural virtue that they didn't have in other parts of the world. And there was always the possibility to go west and keep going west. right? And this wasn't, if you're looking for who's the winner, well, clearly the indigenous Americans aren't the winners, right? They're pretty much the losers continually for 400 years. But if your goal was to germinate the idea of property rights and sovereignty and freedom, right, in a European culture, then North America, with all of these various colonies vying for power with each other, was your best bet. And what you got was this Darwinian crucible of competition, competing force against another competing organization over and over again, and I guess the really awful ones died, right? I mean, when the Spanish showed up and treated every single, indigenous person like a slave, right? That didn't help them much. But of course, the interesting part of the story with regard to Spain is the Spanish show up and they see gold, and their view is, we're just going to murder everybody, enslave everybody to take the gold, and we're here for the gold. Okay. And so they did that. They achieved it. They used guns and germs and steel to take the gold. They shipped the gold back to Spain. They inflated the gold supply by a factor of 3, and you had the Cantillon effect. The people that originally grabbed the gold got rich. The traders in the port that it landed in got rich. And then over 100 years, the price of everything in Spain tripled. And they had hyperinflation in their own country, and they collapsed their own economy because, as you know, you can't eat gold, and gold doesn't cure disease, and you can't ship food with gold, right? Gold is not a factory. It's not a flour mill. It doesn't generate energy. It doesn't give you horses, right? It doesn't give you any of the things in life. So if your idea was, let's just go grab the precious metal, the metal's not precious, and they discovered that gold isn't money, right? It's a defective money, and they ended up corrupting and collapsing their own economy in that pursuit. On the other hand, the French took this other low impact approach, which is, we'll trade for furs and we'll colonize a bit, but lukewarm. And that didn't work so well either. And the British came in this middle territory. We're going to colonize, and we're going to create manufacturing and agriculture. And that turned out to be the most rational of the 3 approaches. And then the next 200 years are this maneuvering. And the question is, what religion is the best one? And the answer is none. No state religion is the best one. That was that answer. And then what's the best form of government? And the answer is one with checks and balances, with a lower assembly or a higher assembly and a separate executive branch and a settled body of law that gives rights to the individual. And it wasn't always clear that was going to happen. That wasn't every colony. That's just the amalgam of what came out after all of the back and forth. The authoritarians, they got pushed out of the continent, right? If you want to read a blood-curdling story of just about the worst executive imaginable, read the story of Peter Stuyvesant. And the irony is, we name high schools after this guy in New York. It's just flabbergasting to me that Stuyvesant actually manages to have any kind of positive name recognition when the guy was the most horrific actor, that, you can identify in the history of the country. And on one hand, I guess you can rehabilitate a name, but he was the death of the Dutch Empire in the New World because of the irrational behavior and the way that he just so brutally disrespected every human being that was under his charge. And so I guess there's a certain degree of justice, natural justice, that came about because this this experiment was allowed to continue in isolation from more powerful political, economic, and military forces for a long enough period of time to settle into call it a rational or local minimum, or a rational outcome, right? After there's that joke, they say, like, this is the Americans will do the right thing after they've tried everything else. Right, like whatever we had after the revolution, it was the best thing after everything else had been tried, and the horrific, stupid ideas had failed, right? And the suboptimal ideas had been displaced with more optimal ideas, right? And this book kind of gives you the hundreds and hundreds of stories as a set of human beings that are self-interested careen toward a stable political economic system which creates the most prosperity for the greatest number.
Yeah, I mean it's definitely you almost wouldn't expect the outcome from reading the beginning or the first volume on all the terrible colonial governors and all of that. And I just to sort of go through some of what you had been discussing, I agree. The gridlock was a huge component of why the American colonies succeeded, particularly the gridlock in Britain. And it was their constitutional government, in a sense, that almost allowed for that gridlock, at least initially gridlock in the form of, well, it's going to be hard for the English king to subjugate the colonists when the English king is dealing with a revolt, right? Which he was dealing with in the in like the mid 1600s, and then he got his head chopped off, and then there's going to be gridlock when you have basically the William Walpole, more or less Britain's first prime minister, basically trying to prevent Britain from imposing or enforcing various rules on the American people. And as you mentioned, the abundance of land is a huge thing, and also the abundance of simply the ocean. The Atlantic Ocean might be one of the most important components of this, because England had subjugated Ireland. Ireland was turned into their colony, and Ireland's not that far away from England, but of course you have to go across the Atlantic, and once you're there, once you're in the New World, you have a tendency to associate more with the New World. And that was Great Britain's problem. It's that a lot of people consider them British, but Great Britain didn't want to give them any say in their government, and that alienated a lot of people. And then, of course, when you're trying to impose feudalism, there's just simply so much land. You can go north, you can go south, you can go west. There's just so much land, and everybody can have their piece, and everybody can homestead. And it was that land that really kind of imbibed them with it really taught them the importance of private property. Hey, this is mine. This is my land. I built that log cabin. I built this farm. I chopped down these trees. It's mine. It's not yours, as opposed to Europe, where they're on some feudal manor that's been there for hundreds of years, etc. And another sort of unsung hero, we've mentioned it, is this concept of the Enlightenment, right? This Enlightenment in the late 1600s, early 1700s, incredibly important, because basically teaching people to use reason and to think that how the world has existed before is not necessarily how the world has to exist now. Life was nasty, brutish, and short. People were killing people. You did what you were told to do. You didn't, you burned buildings down. You slaughtered people. You enslaved people. You fought for a king. You would sacrifice your children, basically, getting them drafted, and they could get their arm chopped off or something like that. And the world worked according to how whatever relevant religion you were worshiping. And then along comes basically the Enlightenment in England and the Scottish Enlightenment to teach people the importance of discovering natural law, of how the world works. We can use reason to figure out, basic science, and then we can use reason to figure out the social sciences, natural rights. Someone saying, I have ownership over my body, you have self-ownership, that was incredibly controversial at the time, because you're basically saying, I have certain rights. The king's rights can only go so far, or the government's rights can only go so far over my person, and as they soon realized, my property. And having that, and John Locke was a very big part of this. And one of my favorite sort of stories in Rothbard's book is, so you've got John Locke's 2 treatises of government. It's this huge, complicated work. It's still read today. It's this towering work in political philosophy and all of that. And your average people, your average colonists, they were Lockeans, but they didn't read John Locke. And they didn't have time to read John Locke. They got to work on their farm. They gotta hunt something. They got to fight against invaders, or they didn't even know how to read, or at that level of reading in depth. But instead, you have Cato's Letters by John Trenchard and Thomas Gordon, and they're the ones really sort of distilling the Lockean creed of liberty, property, and so on. And it's basically in a pamphlet format, almost the SparkNotes version. And that's how people are actually going to really recognize the importance of the Enlightenment, and to realize that, hey, wait a second, the government maybe isn't protecting me. The government's an aggressor. The king's an aggressor. And that led to sort of further consequences, such as the revolution and et cetera. And I view the Enlightenment as one of the most significant achievements in human history, just because this is now, we realize that what was the past doesn't always have to be the past, and we can try to create a better world. And of course, we've had various degrees of success and in failure, but just the ability to say, all right, we can now devise institutions, rules over the marketplace and government that can hopefully lead to a more prosperous society. And just even that fact of even having technological progress, even having advancements was extremely radical. And there was a whole confluence of events in the colonies, and part of that was just Britain was too preoccupied. There's so much land. Part of it is that the colonists revolted whenever the British or the English, and then the British tried to impose their rule. And that led to, quote unquote, I have a lot of problems with the Constitution, as Rothbard sort of goes into the later volume. But the Constitution, or really the United States, is kind of like the best form of government in many ways that we've been able to devise. And it came out of this, basically you could say, this weird sort of cauldron of literally this coliseum, you will, of people killing other people and fighting and bloodshed, and governments are toppled, and then a governor's in charge, and he gets the boot, and then they bring someone else, and then he gets the boot, and all of that. And it's just and then the end result is you have this big revolution that in many ways, like so many other revolutions, could have turned out terribly. You could have had some dictator. You could have had George Washington. A lot of credit has to be gone to George Washington. He basically resisted a dictatorship multiple times. Man was not perfect. I think there were flaws in some of the policies he pursued as president, et cetera. But he didn't become a dictator, and that's it's an important precedent. And it's just it's almost a marvel. You're kind of going like, oh yeah, this all happened. This is how it all worked out, because it could have turned out so differently. And it was definitely part reason, and it was definitely part accident. And those two were definitely intermingled, and we're here with the results.
The syllabus for my new online economics course, Principles of Economics, is now available on Saifedean.com. The course will take place over 18 lectures, each based on one chapter from my new book, Principles of Economics, which will be available for free as an ebook for everyone registering for the course. Lectures will be released once every 2 weeks on Mondays, starting on the 25th of September 2023, and will be available in video and audio format. Live discussion seminars will be held once a week on Thursdays at alternating time slots, 12 hours apart, to ensure learners can attend from all over the world. To enroll, sign up for a membership on Saifedean.com and receive a 20% discount if you sign up before the 20th of September.
Saif, if you were to ask, like, so what's something that you took away from the book that that was new or novel? I think the impression of a typical American educated student is the colonists showed up, struggled to create a new world. There was a disagreement, and there was a single revolution, and we founded a country. And after I read the book, what I was struck by was there was one long, never-ending revolution going on from the very beginning here. Like there was a fight between the people and authority everywhere, all the time, every day. They were disobeying laws. They were disobeying or fighting against taxes. They were attempting to rebel. They were fomenting rebellion after rebellion after rebellion after rebellion, and it was a never-ending cycle of political violence, real violence, and non-conformity and non-compliance. And I think that gets whitewashed out of the history books. Nobody wants to tell you that every colony was in conflict with the British or with whoever was running the colony from the very beginning, and they all had good reason. And so I'm struck by how ironic it is. For example, all the laws that were passed almost always were ignored, routinely, all the time. All the quick rents that were allowed, all the rents, the proprietors had the right to property tax or to levy property taxes, and half the time they were never paid, and there was struggle after struggle after struggle where people just wouldn't pay their taxes, ever, and they would tar and feather the tax collector or just send him back, at the point of a gun. And a lot of times people, just gave up on trying to collect the taxes. And the only way you collect the taxes is with a military, and even then, half the time it didn't work. So there was extraordinary amount of non-compliance and struggle from the beginning. And the American Revolution was just the culmination of what had been going on continually. And so I think that's important, and I think that's the human condition. And you're kind of led to then ask the question, well, if that's basically the human condition, how come they succeeded in America, but they didn't succeed as effectively in most of the countries in Europe? And you kind of conclude it's not. I don't know that it's a difference in human nature. Human nature seems to be the same everywhere, but what you had was a difference in geography. You had that isolation from the massive armies of the authoritarians, and the fact that you couldn't. It was much more difficult to administer authority, because if you sent people to the New World, immediately what they would do was go off and find their own farm and create their own life. They didn't want to fight. They wanted to actually live happily ever after. So you lost control of them continually. And that's one of the takeaways. The other is, I think this is a story of energy. Like, we talked about channeling energy, but really what America represents was the largest pool of natural energy or natural property available to the European culture. The Northern Europeans were going to spread everywhere in the world and dominate, right? And they dominated Africa, they dominated South America, they dominated China. They dominated Asia, right? This is just one of the parts of the world they were dominating, and they were dominating with gunpowder, gunships, and steel and superior technology, just because they could. So the story of America is that very advanced culture. They get to America, and And they just ran into this massive pool of energy more than anywhere else in the world. For example, I just flew from Malta to Baltimore. Okay, Malta has no water. Okay, so when you're flying over the Mediterranean, you look down, you look at what can you achieve with no water, right? The Mediterranean is good for some things, but the carrying capacity of the island is only in the thousands unless you can actually create water. Very difficult. So there are a lot of parts of the world, North Africa, Greece, they were denurtured. Their forests were stripped. Their land was overfarmed. If they had fertile land that was good for agriculture, it was destroyed by endless wars. Right, and that's the story of Roman history and Greek history. Endless wars, destroying fertile land, and then in other cases, they just didn't have the water. But when you land in Baltimore, you fly over the Chesapeake Bay. And if you look down at the Chesapeake Bay, you see endless water. You have fresh water flowing into an inland sea, which is protected from the hostile weather and from hostile waveforms. And it's the perfect place for you to farm, for you to implement agriculture. And even today, 400 years after they showed up, it's all farms and fresh water. And the entire east coast of the United States is incredibly fertile. So, what is energy? Water, fresh water is energy. If you have elevation that drives fresh water, that creates fertile farmland, and you can grow corn and food and soybeans and the like, you can implement agriculture. It will lead to industry, and in this period in time, it's just incredibly high energy laden land. Not all land is created equal. If I give you 100 square miles of rock with no natural water, you can't grow anything there, and your population is limited to the water you can capture in a cistern in the rainy season. So if you don't have the people, you're not going to have the army. If you don't have the army, you're not going to have the military power. You're not going to have the economic power. And so what the Europeans found was they found a very good temperate climate, especially from, Virginia, Northern Carolina to Virginia through Massachusetts and the like. It was a very favorable climate. It was very favorable land. They had a very simple set of indigenous dwellers to displace. And, look, whenever you study the history of Greece, the Greeks displaced everyone in, 500 BC, and then the Romans displaced everybody, and before them, the Phoenicians, and before them, somebody else. So the story of civilization is the Neolithic culture displacing the Stone Age culture, and the Bronze and Copper Age displacing the stone, and then bronze displacing them, and iron displacing them, and steel displacing them, and Greek fire displacing somebody else, and gunpowder displacing someone else. And so it's a never-ending displacement of the previous people by the more powerful culture. And America was naturally it was going to happen just because of geography, and the rest is the political history is the story of this person did this and that person did that. But by the time you get to the end of this book and you're reading about the American Revolution, the conclusion is, all of the American generals were goofballs. The good ones were undermined politically by the bad ones, right? The politicians undermined the tacticians. George Washington wasn't the best general, but it didn't matter. They made a host of awful military decisions, but at the end of the day, the winner is geography, because the people that got sent to fight them didn't want to fight, and they were going to desert as soon as they could desert. And so when you tell the story from a patriotic point of view, you want to talk about the great leader that heroically defeated the evil enemy. But this is really a story of an incredibly fertile land that was colonized by an advanced culture with superior technology that kind of stumbled into stewardship and supremacy despite their best efforts, meandering, careening toward the future, and winning because they were just the least worst managed group of people, and they were driven by underlying human motives, which are everybody wants sovereignty, everybody wants freedom, and if they can get it by realigning with a better organization or a better government, they will. And if they can't, they'll run. And if they can't run anymore, they'll fight. And if it turns out that the enemy is too far away and too dysfunctional to fight back, then they will emerge to become the government. And then at the point they become the government, they will win. And then immediately upon winning, they will start to become corrupted by their own power and recreate the same dysfunctional tyranny that they were fleeing from until they collapse under their own weight and something else takes their place.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'd say, if I were to interject here, I'd say the details of the specific conflicts, obviously many, but the overall theme, as you mentioned very astutely at the beginning, Michael, is that technology wins. And I think another way of putting this is that capitalism effectively wins. So one major disadvantage that the Native Americans had was the fact that they did not have property rights. So this just, on top of the fact that they didn't have all the modern technologies that Europeans had, Native Americans also did not have property rights, in that they were not able to protect and enforce their sovereignty over plots of land, because they did not have the concept of individual property rights. And so this, as you were saying earlier, Patrick, they say this entire plot of land was ours, but then, nobody had put a fence around it. Nobody had made a settled farm in it. Nobody had built a house in it. And that makes property rights difficult to enforce, because these people are usually also nomadic and traveling around. And so they did not have land that could have been easily marked off as this is ours. And in fact, this, Rothbard, I think, makes the point that it might have made for easier coexistence between Europeans and the Native Americans if property rights of Native Americans were clearer, because the continent was enormous and there was a lot of room for Europeans to come and settle and trade. And in many cases, of course, they did trade. Obviously, the history books, the news, like the history, has a vested interest in if it bleeds, it leads. And so we miss all the hundreds of years of peaceful interaction that took place between Europeans and Native Americans, because it's just not as newsworthy. But in reality, of course, they benefited enormously from trade. And if there were property rights, and if they developed this institution of capitalism and more advanced methods of economic organization, they would have arguably fared better, even with all of the technological disadvantages. But yeah, ultimately, and this is a theme that I discuss in the Principles of Economics textbook that I just published, there's a lot to be depressed about in the world. A lot of bad things happen and a lot of bad people win, as you said. But ultimately, their technology and capitalism are like a superpower in the hand of whoever is able to wield it. As you were saying, in the US, the reason that amongst, from this crucible of horrible horrors, something better kept on emerging is that people could escape. And the people who offered property rights and more freedom would attract more manpower and more soldiers, and effectively overrun the ones that offered less freedom and less property rights. And so this, I think, is the, if we wanted to take an optimistic tone, an optimistic conclusion from the book, it would be this, that no matter how tyrannical, as you were saying, those governments, those rebels then take over and then they become the tyrants and they become the oppressors. This cycle continues, and we move from one tribe being the oppressor to another. But all along, what is constantly winning is technology, in that the technologies of these tribes are developed. Because they have property rights and capitalism, they're able to develop new and advanced ways of organizing economic production. And then when they become stagnant, those ideas are copied, and then people who are able to supplement them with more free market capitalism and more property rights and better economic organization end up supplanting the people who had calcified and became sclerotic and became tyrants and didn't allow economic freedom. So in a sense, we do see the positive story of where the title Conceived in Liberty might be coming from, and where it leads to some hope. But I think, Rothbard himself, he's also quite critical of the American Revolution in many ways. And he's, he separates the revolutionaries into two general camps: the more libertarian, liberty-minded camps of people like Jefferson, and then the more corporatist and government control camp, which essentially, he argues, thought that the way of the outcome of the revolution should be that they should take over the state apparatus of the British Crown, so that what the US really needed was just local tyranny rather than foreign tyranny. Whereas the Jeffersonians were more into the idea of, we don't want tyranny at all. So, and we're going to have another session to discuss all of this in 2 days. So we're going to get into this into more detail. But I'm curious about your thoughts on this aspect, on this split.
They have those movies, where sometimes the twist at the end is you find out that the hero was the villain, and the person you've been rooting for the entire movie turns out to be the villain. When you do read this book, all 260 plus chapters, you get to the point in the Revolutionary War where the Americans have won, thrown off the yoke of imperialism, but they haven't yet established the nation. And every school kid is taught, well, then we had the Federalist Papers, and we weren't quite done, and we had to create the federal government, and then it was all good. And I'm left with the thought that maybe they just should have stopped at the end of the Revolutionary War and left the colonies independent without actually establishing the federal government. And maybe all of our heroes that we see as founding fathers that established the national government, maybe they're the ones that just imposed an even greater authoritarianism on America than the British had imposed, and we would have been better off if we hadn't completed that, right? And he kind of leaves you thinking that be careful what you wish for, because when the British were running the U.S., they had a hard time imposing their will on Americans. But as soon as Americans were running the U.S., they found it to be much easier to impose their will on Americans. And you're better off to have a very distant, ineffective authoritarian than to have a local, very effective, efficient authoritarian. And so, I do think that. I think that your point on the Indians is a good one, which is there's two stories here. There's the story of the Europeans struggling with each other and the colonists struggling with each other against the Europeans, and that's a very interesting story. And the other story is just the European colonists struggling with all of the Native American tribes. That's a second story, and maybe even a more powerful one in a way. And as I started, I said, look, this is really it's the story of the most powerful overcoming the less powerful. So, the most powerful ideology, capitalism is a more powerful ideology than communism, right? And, certain currency, gold is a more powerful currency than seashells, and Bitcoin is a more powerful currency than gold. And the British culture was a more powerful culture. The European culture was more powerful than the Native American culture. and the government, the republic government was more powerful than the tribal cultures that they displaced. But you can see clearly the American Indians. I guess it's popular to talk about, to act like they're like Adam and Eve in the garden and they're the innocents. But the truth is, they were awful in every regard to each other, and in some ways more humane than the thing that replaced them. And the culture definitely wasn't best for humanity. It wasn't the most powerful. It wasn't the most humane in any way. You could point out they didn't have property rights, right? And since they didn't have property rights, any random Indian could sell away everybody's land, right, to anybody else. And so it's pretty dysfunctional if you don't have property rights, because you will tend to be the loser in that struggle. But they didn't have a common language. They didn't have a written language. They didn't have a history. They didn't have, a shared law. They didn't have any other shared mores. And what can you say about a society that never invented the wheel? The real indictment of the American Indians is they used a wheel for pottery, but they didn't actually use a wheel for locomotion. They never figured out how to turn it on its side. And so no wheels, no effective domestication of animals, no mills, no machinery, all of the things that were part of European civilization in 2500 BC, they still had not made. They're literally stuck around 25,000 BC, and they were not moving forward. And the result was a whole lot of human misery. So I suppose at the end of the day, it's hard to lament displacing that culture with a European culture. Certainly the life expectancy and the prosperity that followed from the European culture would be greater for the common person. And it was kind of inevitable. And we don't write much about it because it's just, I guess they didn't record the history, and it's almost like a footnote in a way. But all of this is, there was an energy source, and there was an organization that showed up that was more powerful, and they found a way to harness the energy in order to create human prosperity. And certainly today you have 300 plus million people in the US, with an average life expectancy of, 80. And if you compare that to some few million people with an average life expectancy of 30 or 35 that, are carrying water 10 miles a day, it's kind of hard to want to go back to that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. No, I agree. I think those are great points. I mean, certainly, especially what Saifedean brought up about the private ownership, and even just, it comes down to the culture. And something else that's also interesting, sort of adding on to that, there's a great book called The Myth of the Ecological Indian. I think it's by Stephen Kresh. I think that's how you pronounce the last name. And going through, it's how sometimes we have this myth that it was also environmentalists, and that was not true. Many tribes believed in reincarnation and the fact that you could just kill as many deer as you needed and more would sprout up. And that was obviously not conducive to growth or conservation of natural resources and in human prosperity ultimately. And that, opened the door. I mean, and especially the difficulties over land ownership, or what counted as ownership, basically allowed enabled the English colonists to really sort of capitalize in homestead the incredible amount of land, the forests, the turn it into the farmland, and so on. And the ultimate sort of, you could say, driver of a lot of this is geography. Even when Europe, the only reason Britain was able to basically do its own thing is because of the English Channel. Right. And then geography with the American colonies because of the Atlantic Ocean, and then just so much land. And even in a sense, as mentioned, geography with the American Revolution, because as Michael pointed out, we never won any of our battles with the way the generals wanted them to win, the pitched battles, your army versus my army at 4:00 today, show up. We won with guerrilla warfare. ambushing supply lines. We knew the terrain, we knew the geography more, and the British soldiers didn't want to have to deal with that, and that was a huge component. And yeah, I think describing it as sort of energy is a very succinct way of putting it, because this new world literally just had so much stuff for the taking, and that led to one of the most powerful countries in world history. And in many ways, it's energy. The land was very fertile. There was a lot of the land, and all it took was just some people with understanding private property and then reading some pamphlets about it, or the Twitter of the past, so to speak, and then they're off to the races.
Yeah, what you see is it's a triumph of the most powerful ideology, the most powerful currency. The Indians didn't have the currency either, right? So it's power. Even the religions, right? Islam and Christianity, they're the most powerful religions for channeling political energy and aligning people's interest, and so what you have is an arc of history with powerful ideas, powerful technology, eventually driving a succession, and America is the result of that to date.
Well, you hinted at something, Michael, in your comments a few minutes ago, where you were saying Rothbard sort of leaves you hanging, thinking, was the whole thing a good idea, or would we have been better off? And I think this I want to make that the main topic of conversation of the next episode, because I think the tax that was imposed on the tea that launched the revolution was what, I think 1.5% or 2% on tea imports. Which, if you ask any person who's liberty-minded, would you take a 2% tax on tea and get rid of the U.S. federal government's mountains of taxation regulation? I don't think there's any doubt where the question would go. So, the case I think could be made that getting rid of the king sounds nice in principle, because you think, all right, we're all just going to be free. But the monarchist in me will say that when you get rid of a king, you don't just end up with no king. You end up with 1 million little kings who are competing over short 4-year terms to become kings. And then the difference is that when you had one king, he was there for many decades, and he expected his children and his grandchildren to be there for centuries, generations after generation. And so he was invested in the well-being of the country into the future, because he wanted it to be functional for his grandkids to steal or to appropriate money from your grandkids. So you had incentive alignment. He wanted you to have healthy, prosperous grandkids, and you wanted to have healthy, prosperous grandkids. Whereas on the other hand, when you replace that king with 100 little kings, then each one of those kings is only going to get 4 years, or maybe 8. And then it's only 4 or 8 years, and that's all the time he's got under the sun. And that's the time, he's got to make hay while the sun shines, as they say. He needs to try and get as much as he can, and it doesn't matter to him. The well-being of your grandchild is completely irrelevant to him, because his grandchild is not likely going to be on the throne to be able to take taxes from your grandchild. So it is in his interest to milk the country dry as much as he can for 4 or 8 years.
I'll look forward to discussing this subject with you in our next session.
Yeah, I think this has been fascinating, and we have another couple of hours on Thursday. So, any final thoughts before we break off?
Are you in favor of King George III, Saifedean? Is that what you're saying?
I mean, compared to some of the things that the glorious revolution has brought the U.S., I think you'd struggle to find somebody who would not take him over at least some of the U.S. presidents, wouldn't you?
My final thought is the book's worth reading because America was an experiment in political economy. And if you're a scientist, a political scientist, you would always like to be able to implement a new idea. What if we had this economic system? What if we had communism? What if we had authoritarianism? What if we had capitalism? What if we had strong religion? What if we had a weak religion? What if we were tolerant of religions? What if we cooperated? What if we didn't? What if we traded? What if we did agriculture? And it's very difficult to run that experiment in a mature society because you're inheriting 1,000 years of legacy. So you couldn't easily run that experiment, in a canton of Switzerland or the middle of Austria at that time. But in America, what you had was a Stone Age culture receding, and you were able to drop dozens of these experiments into the middle of an energy-rich, fairly isolated geography. And you were able to see their homogeneous or organic evolution without someone simply crossing the border and stamping them out with brute force in the first month. So if you're a political scientist or an economist and you want to study what will happen if I tell people that they're not allowed to own any land. Well, we know what happened. Everybody starved to death within a few months. You can literally see examples of of economic dysfunction where everybody stops working and they all starve because the leader had a batshit, stupid, crazy economic model. And so you have lots and lots of these examples. If this happens, that will happen. What will happen if you do this? Conceived in Liberty is the story of human behavior and how they react to so many different political experiments. And so I think you can learn a lot by studying each one of them. And, many of them end in the death of the instigator or the death of everybody or extraordinary chaos and abuse. And so I think it's a lot better to learn vicariously than it is to learn through your own experiences. And this was 200 of these 262 chapters, but more than that, hundreds and hundreds of experiments that end in the death and destruction of the idiot or the malefactor and everyone that was trapped in that economy with them. And so science is about trial and error, right? And humanity has advanced through trial and error, and we take for granted the fact that we can create steel, and we forget that there are probably 10,000 tries at it that failed and everybody died trying. We take for granted you can eat that berry, and we forget that the people that ate the other berries all died. And we take for granted that this bridge works, and we forget that 8,000 other bridges collapsed and everybody died. And so a lot of times we just take modernity for granted, but Conceived in Liberty is a book of experimental results saying, if you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this will happen. If you do this, this will happen. And you get to see 1,000 failed experiments, right? 1,000 blow-ups. And eventually you get to some amalgam which is decent enough to get us where we are today. And if anything, it's valuable to the modern thinker because you can't really afford, to implement a catastrophic experiment without destroying your entire country or your family. If you go to this place, right, go to Zimbabwe, go to Cuba, go to North Korea, you'll get to make that mistake once and then you're done, right? So I just think this is valuable because Rothbard was truthful, unvarnished, right? He didn't have a pro-statist agenda or a apologist agenda. He wasn't trying to whitewash history and tell you how everything turned out perfect. He wasn't defending anybody. As far as I can, as I can see, right? The there aren't that many heroes in this book. There's a lot of villains. There's a number of people that tried to do the right thing and struggled. So I guess they're sort of the heroes. But it's very rare in the modern world that you get to read a tome of all of the political, economic experiments of humanity gone bad. And this is that tome. And you can't design something beautiful and functional and stable unless you understand all the ways the machines break, right? And this is that book. And so I would just end with a thought that it's worthwhile for anybody that has aspirations to design something better or live a life or give advice. You ought to go back and read this one and keep it in mind when you're trying to inscribe your ego and your ideas on the world.
I agree. I think it's a great book to read, and it certainly changed my perspective, and other people should read it as well.
Excellent. Well, we'll pick up where we left off on Thursday. Thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.